Hello, good evening. Welcome to Novara Live. My name is Bastani. Tonight, it's Tuesday, which invariably means I'm joined by Helena, aka No Justice MTG, on YouTube and Twitch. Helena, how are you?
I'm doing very well. I had a pretty good day today, and I'm very much looking forward to the show, as always, with you, Aaron.
We're talking about a number of people. We're not talking about Nigel Farage and UKIP. That purple, it brings back memories of UKIP in 2015. I don't want you to take that personally. I love purple, but it's a very distinct shade. Coming up later tonight, we'll be talking George Galloway. He's revealed a slate of candidates running for his Workers' Party of Great Britain. A senior Tory has indicated that party members should no longer pick their leader when the Tories are in government. And Keir Starmer has been caught lying again. The race is on to replace Humza Yousaf as leader of the Scottish National Party. But while that happens, the work of the Scottish government has to continue. Even in politics, the show must go on. Early this morning, the Scottish Cabinet had its weekly meeting at Bute House. There, they discussed how a minority administration will work over the near term, with Yousaf apparently applauded as he entered the Cabinet room. Shortly after that, it was announced that a motion of no confidence would be scheduled for tomorrow. That motion is being submitted by the Labour Party, with Scottish Labour leader Anas Sarwar set to lead that debate mid-afternoon. Now, that motion matters because if it passes, government ministers will be obliged to stand down. Only a simple majority is required, so there is a low threshold for success. But it seems almost certain to fail because the Scottish Greens aren't on board, and neither are the Tories. The former have urged Labour MSPs to stop their, quote, game playing and drop the votes. Meanwhile, the Scottish Conservatives, who put forward their own motion of no confidence in Yousaf previously, have made it clear their target was the First Minister and not the government. That should, after an extraordinarily hard week for the SNP, be something of a good news story for them. So who is most likely to replace Yousaf as the party leader? Already the two favourites are coming into focus. Kate Forbes was defeated by Yousaf when the two went head-to-head all the way back in 2023. Before then, she was a rising star in the party, delivering the Scottish budget in 2020 when she was just 30 years old. She fell short against Yousaf primarily because of her socially conservative views. She's personally opposed to abortion, same-sex marriage, premarital sex, and Scotland's Gender Recognition Act, which was introduced by the SNP. And Forbes is on record that her private faith impacts her political positions. Last February, Forbes claimed that she would have voted against same-sex marriage if she'd been an MSP when it was legalised in Scotland a decade ago. Another candidate being widely touted is John Swinney. Swinney is 60 years old and an old head for the party. He was first elected as an MP to Westminster in 1997, becoming an MSP 2 years later, and was the SNP party leader between 2000 and 2004. Neither Swinney nor Forbes is associated with the left of the party, although Swinney is viewed as a more moderate figure both socially and on the economy. Earlier today, I spoke to David Jamieson. He's the editor of Conter, whose podcast, Contercast, has the Twitter bio against the Scottish establishment. I started by asking David how likely Swinney and Forbes are to stand.
John Swinney definitely will. He's an old hand in the party. He was, in fact, party leader 2 decades ago when he was widely seen as quite an ineffectual leader. Kate Forbes is the former finance minister a couple of years back and is seen as the kind of young blood, but it needs to be said, she's part of the party establishment, or was in that sense. Swinney is very much part of the kind of Sturgeonite centre faction of the party. Kate Forbes is very much seen as a figure on the right of the party, I think fairly so, both in terms of her economic policies when she was finance minister. She was a very austerian, very pro-market finance minister. And in terms of her social views anyway, she is, and maybe people have heard this, a member of the Free Church of Scotland, which is a kind of conservative Presbyterian splinter from the main church organisation, and that attracts a lot of comment. But I think it's fair to say she's a figure on the right of the party. It's perhaps less likely she'll stand, but she could well. She was making noises in the last few hours that implied she was seriously considering it. Perhaps she's fishing for support in the party, or perhaps she'll really go for it. Swinney, I think, needs to stand because he is the party establishment and stability figure. He's coming in to steer the party over the next very difficult couple of years.
Yeah, it's reminiscent for me of somebody like Michael Howard with the Conservative Party in the mid 2000s, just like say steering them through troubled waters. Sometimes that's no bad thing. What other candidates could we be looking at amongst the SNP MSPs, and are there any from the left?
I mean, the only other name I've seen chucked around which seems in any way plausible is someone like Jenny Gilruth, but she's already come out for Swinney. There isn't really a left wing of the party beyond a couple of individuals. And when we say the left wing of the party, we usually mean the Sturgeonite faction. We mean someone like Humza Yousaf. I mean, he was putatively on the left wing of the party. So is Stephen Flynn, who's the Westminster leader. Both of them call themselves socialists, though it doesn't seem to amount to very much or even really anything. So to the extent that there's a left wing of the party, they're going to plump for the status quo establishment faction of the party. I'm afraid there's not much life beyond that. In Scottish politics, as in so much of the world, left now means socially and economically liberal, really. Perhaps with a few policy nuances on the economic front, whereas right means generally kind of economically liberal with a slightly more socially conservative or culture war orientation, and that's the role that Kate Forbes fulfills. The SNP is a broad tent party, but these days it's not a particularly broad tent.
So going back to Humza Yousaf, who you say is on the Sturgeonite wing of the party, what did you make of his announcement yesterday? Because as somebody in England has an interest in Scottish politics, but certainly not immersed in it, I knew there was a rolling story, but it just seemed to come to a head so quickly and so strangely. This seems entirely avoidable, entirely self-inflicted. Can you explain what has happened and how it's happened? Because, like I say, looking from the south, it makes very little sense.
It occurred to me before I came on this call that everything I'm going to say in terms of the big picture, I would have said whether this had happened or not. I could have said it a year ago. I could even have said it 2 or 3 years ago. I think there's going to be two broad narratives about what's just happened. One is that this was a completely self-inflicted injury. It came out of a clear blue sky. It's almost inexplicable. It might just be that Humza Yousaf is a total incompetent who's, sort of self-destructive. Now, look, there's obviously an element of truth in that. He handled the last few days about as badly as you could. So in one sense, yes, this is just a calamitous and almost inexplicable series of events. But I think this is actually deeply meaningful. If you look back over the last few years, going back as far perhaps as 2017 or 2016, the SNP's project has been hollow. And everything that Nicola Sturgeon has done in those years before Humza Yousaf and everything Humza Yousaf has done in the last year has been based around that vacuum in the center of the project. There hasn't been a real independence campaign in the last few years. The intellectual work done around independence has been to hollow it out even as a concept, as a political project. So Nicola Sturgeon adapted Scottish independence into a kind of new Scottish independence light, where Scotland would be hollowed out of its popular sovereignty. We'd make alliances with the European Union, with NATO, with the remaining British state, and so forth. And Scottish independence would come about because it was acceptable to the most powerful brokers in the international system. This is a view of independence which has made it naturally rudderless. You've completely evacuated a nationalist movement of the concept of popular sovereignty. And that makes independence captive to these powerful brokers. There's a simultaneous process in terms of the actual rule of Scottish society as it currently exists under devolution, where Scotland has been increasingly hollowed out of what sovereignty it possesses right now. So there's been a bonfire, like a fire sale of Scotland's national assets to international capital. In recent years, we've seen the leasing at knocked down prices of Scotland's seabeds to big oil. That was one of the triumphs of the Butte House Agreement, an agreement between the Greens and the SNP. The Scottish public realm has been devastated by round after round of job and service cuts. And so these twin developments, I think, made something like the explosion of recent days inevitable. And that's even before we get to the undiscussable Scottish police investigations and the various investigations that are underway into conduct in the SNP in recent years. So on the one hand, it's inexplicable. On the other, I think we need to see the long-term decay and rot in Scottish politics, which is a byproduct of how the SNP and until very recently the Scottish Greens have ruled the country.
I get all that, and I can totally see the sort of structural long-term arguments you're making there, David. But at the same time, with these sort of vacuous centrist technocrats like Humza Yousaf, the one thing they're meant to be good at is party management and making sure they've got the numbers for things. And the nature of what has unfolded really over the last 6 weeks, month, really does undermine that centrist idea of party management, competence, efficient governance. So is that partly self-inflicted? Because it's something I've been thinking about. Yousaf is 39. There's actually not that much political experience around him. We heard, for instance, that when he was looking to break off the relationship with the Greens, there was the thumping of tables around him from his SNP colleagues. It does feel like they've been in a little bit of an echo chamber in regards to how this would work out. A bit of a bandwagon bias. And as somebody, again, in England used the Westminster system, we don't have mandatory selection. The SNP does. We don't have primaries. We don't have PR. The argument goes that with all those things, and the SNP has two of the three, a very engaged, large membership too, you have more thoughtful politicians who don't have these blinkers, don't have that bandwagon bias. So how do you explain it with Humza Yousaf? Is he just like an idiot or what?
No, I mean, I think you're indicating some of the background problems here. The SNP is actually a very controlled, centrally controlled party. It's very undemocratic. Its conferences are very undemocratic. The membership has very little say in the situation. And it was a very centralized party around the persons, first of Alex Salmond, and then especially of Nicola Sturgeon. Sturgeon very jealously guarded power and didn't bring up behind her an apprentice or apprentices to replace her afterwards. So I think this is partly a product of that. I mean, it is the case, it's absolutely remarkable, to be honest, that as little as a few years ago, anyone in Scottish politics would have noted that there was a huge gap between the quality of political leaders in the SNP and every other party, right? I mean, even outside of Scotland, if you watch British politics closely, you probably know names like Alex Salmond and Nicola Sturgeon, and you probably couldn't name the leaders of the other Scottish parties. So, but in the last 2 or 3 years, that situation has completely inverted. There is no one of obvious quality in the SNP top ranks anymore. And as a result, they've had to bring back John Swinney, a failed leader from 20 years ago. But I do think that the tensions and schisms inside the Scottish government that exploded the Butte House Agreement are partly a consequence of hollowed out technocratic politics. I mean, if you look at the issues which detonated in the final instance, the Butte House Agreement, there are over relatively marginal policy questions. But then what else would the substance of politics be? It needs to be said, because it's not being said enough, The Greens supported every disastrous policy that's come out of the Scottish government in the last few years. They supported Kate Forbes for years as she was passing regressive budgets. The real meat and potatoes of politics, there's a consensus around. And by the way, that consensus extends way beyond the Greens and the SNP to all the unionist parties as well. So politics has become focused on personalities, on schisms, on factions, because at the center of this system is nothing. At the center, there's a vacuum of political purpose. And there's a constant struggle over who gets to be the master of that vacuum. And I think that's a big part of it. I mean, we are actually witnessing the decomposition, I think, not just of the political moment we saw after 2014. And we have to remember, of course, that this government has been in office for 17 years, which tells its own story. But not just the decomposition of this phase of Scottish politics. I think that we are seeing part of an unfolding crisis of the entire devolution settlement. Many of the institutions of the devolved state are under new scrutiny. Many of them are obviously dysfunctional. So that's all part of this picture as well. The one last thing I would say is the unknowns of the situation, right? So Humza Yousaf, for example, may have said in this cabinet meeting where allegedly people were slapping tables over his announcement that he was giving up his parliamentary majority, he may have had to say something to them about why the party needed unity in the coming period, something we can't speculate on. So that may be part of his decision making in this situation. It has to be said as well, Stephen Flynn, the Westminster leader, is making quite hostile noises towards the Greens. So it looks like he at least is not angling for a return to that Butte House agreement that created the parliamentary majority. So there may be other factors here that we don't entirely understand. But again, I would need to say, and by the way, this idea of technocrats are inherently competent people. I think that the hollowing out of politics itself ultimately destroys the competence, because it means that there is no disciplining factor of politics in what you're doing, and that's part of the explanation as well.
Who are the principal political beneficiaries of this? Because presumably Labour are going to make hay. But I'm also particularly interested in the Greens, because like you say, they've supported the SNP through thick and thin, often through very regressive legislation. Could they pick up MSP's political support at the next time of asking? Will they start to poll better? Or are they now out of power for a significantly long time?
It's an interesting question. It is possible that the Greens pick up more seats. I suppose it becomes quite a sociological question, which is about how the culture war works. Because as I've just said, the Greens have supported every disastrous measure of the Scottish government, shredding their own policy prospectus in the meantime. I mean, little remains of whatever it was the Scottish Greens were trying to get out of the Butte House agreement. And having sacrificed everything, having given up everything, having given in to every demand, having been at times utterly humiliated by the SNP, at times the SNP kept the Greens in the dark and outflanked them from the left. So in every conceivable way, the Greens were bullied and humiliated and abandoned all of their policies and all their promises to their base. But in the end, will whipping up anger against particularly the right wing of the SNP aid them in reconstructing and maintaining a political base? I mean, it's a strategy that's worked for them up until now. It's also a kind of engine of just delusion in politics. And the right wing of the SNP benefit, and the wider nationalist movement benefit from this as well. What no one in the nationalist movement wants to admit is the supposed left wing of this car crash and the supposed right wing of this car crash agree on almost everything. And neither of them can come up with a way forward for the independence movement. So that is possible. Naturally, that Labour will win, and they're going to win extra seats in the general election. You assume, though who knows where we are by then, in 2026, if the current parliament lasts that long, they will pick up more seats then as well. But the overwhelming picture is one of status in the political system and of a corrosion of the Scottish political system. The one last thing I would say is that I think if anyone had any doubts up until now, they should know that the independence movement is finished as an immediate term project and probably as a medium term project as well. We're now talking about the national movement being a longer term project, and that needs to begin with a serious political reckoning. That needs to begin with a serious reconstruction of what this movement is for based on the idea of popular sovereignty. Because this idea that you can achieve independence through the say-so of a body of international and impeccably hostile actors from Washington to Brussels to London is ludicrous. And it is holding the independence movement in suspended animation as just a tool to construct political fiefdoms for the SNP and various other factions. That needs to go. You know, as well as I do, no political movement deserves to exist just by the dint of its own existence. You have to prove yourself in real political terms, and that means a radical reconstruction of the independence case over the coming period, or it could really die. I mean, this could be the end of the line, period, and not just for the next few years.
That was David Jamieson speaking to me earlier today. Such an impressive guy. Even if the cause of independence is in disarray, the SNP is in freefall, it seems. Let's see. There are some very sharp people associated with that movement north of the border. George Galloway intends for his Workers' Party to run a full slate of candidates across almost 650 parliamentary seats up for grabs at the next general election. With currently only one MP, himself, that might seem like Galloway has a long way to go. But the Workers' Party has taken a giant leap towards that goal by unveiling 200 new parliamentary candidates today. This was Galloway describing the party's new candidates outside Parliament.
We have assembled in such a short time a remarkable team, which is going to change this election. You should look at it this way. I speak really to the media here. We will have the same impact on Labour that Mr. Farage and the Reform Party are likely to have on the Conservatives. In other words, we will win seats, but in potentially hundreds of seats, we will materially affect the result. As I think you'll find is going to happen in the West Midlands mayoral election on Thursday, and maybe elsewhere in local authority results. The truth is, there's a huge number of people in Britain who are fed up with the two cheeks of the same backside. They don't find either cheek any more attractive than the other, and they're not prepared to vote for the backsides that are presented to us as the best that we can have. We say Britain deserves better than the dwarfish political class that leads the opposition in Britain.
I find it quite amusing how sort of Galloway got lost in his metaphor there. You know, Britain deserves a better backside, a better cheek. Anyway, amongst the new Workers' Party parliamentary candidates are two former UK ambassadors, former members of the UK and European parliaments, and former Labour councillors. But they have one star candidate in particular. Monty Panesar is a former England cricketer who will be contesting the Ealing Southall seat. The Luton-born spin bowler played 50 test matches for England between 2006 and 2013. He was the 2007 Wisden Cricketer of the Year and won 3 Ashes series against the Aussies. Not many English people can say that. The seat he is running for is currently held by Labour's Virendra Sharma, who has been the constituency MP since 2007 and importantly won a 16,000 vote majority in 2019. And it's likely that Ealing Southall won't be the only Labour stronghold to feel the pinch from the Workers' Party. Speaking to LBC, Galloway outlined his party's pitch.
The reality is that we are, if you like, Labour shorn of identity politics, infatuation with race and gender, wokery and greenery and quackery. We are the real deal. We do what we say on the tin. We stand up for the working people. And you and I are also working people. If we lost our wages, salary this week, this month, we'd be in trouble. And that's the great majority of people in this island. Our country's falling apart at the seams, Nick. We can't even control who comes into it. We lose track of the people who do. Can't defend the English Channel while we're sailing gunboats in the Red Sea. It's all gone to pot. Not since 1941 have we been in such a state. And so far, there's no Mr. Churchill to step into the breach.
Interesting analogy there. Because if Starmer isn't Mr. Churchill, presumably George Galloway thinks George Galloway is Mr. Churchill. Anyway, those lines are going to appeal to a lot of people fed up with politically driven culture wars. But there's also the risk they'll appeal to people who are actually racist, homophobic, and climate skeptics. Though perhaps Galloway doesn't see that as much of a risk. Amongst his new candidates is former UKIP member and Tory candidate Harry Boota. In 2016, he was suspended from the party after suggesting that homosexuality stemmed from childhood sexual abuse. According to Galloway, some Labour politicians are already sensing new opportunities at the Workers' Party.
I can confirm that there are several Labour members of Parliament, one Labour Lord, and I'm going to say dozens, at least a dozen, Labour councillors who will defect either this week or more probably next. It's a growing party. We've quadrupled in size since my victory in Rochdale, when, as you well know, I got more votes than all the other major parties put together. Quite an achievement.
Before that interview aired, LBC's Henry Riley posted this on X. Exclusive. 2 current MPs in talks to join George Galloway's Workers' Party, including a serving Labour MP. I'm told Galloway has held discussions with Labour MP Tahir Ali for Birmingham Hall Green, Independent MP, previously Labour MP Claudia Webb for Leicester East. Now, Galloway wouldn't reveal any names in the interview that followed. And very quickly afterwards, Tahir Ali issued a statement unequivocally rejecting claims that he's in talks about defecting from the Labour Party. So far, Claudia Webb hasn't commented on those claims. And Galloway has also promised that his party won't run candidates against what he calls outstanding independents. And he's named Jeremy Corbyn and Diane Abbott as MPs who won't be challenged by the Workers' Party if they run as independents in the upcoming general election. There's no doubt that Galloway is a persuasive figure, but it's unclear whether that's going to translate into parliamentary seats for his party. Helena, what do you make of the Workers' Party's slate of candidates and their prospects of being elected? Galloway may be there after the next general election, but will he be joined by anyone else?
Well, if we look at his kind of broader policy prospectus, the kind of, I guess we've not really seen like specific policies. We've got the kind of the general vibes of the kind of issues that he's looking to run on. What do you kind of broadly have? Economically, kind of, I guess, social democratic, even though they have some other full kind of left-wing elements of the party as well. But when you look at the kind of things they campaign on, broadly social democratic. In terms of social policy, he's clearly marketing himself and the party as being like part of the anti-woke ticket. He's been things like anti-migration in terms of things like net zero policies, talking about catastrophizing green alarmism in terms of the way people discuss things like green policy. When it comes to foreign policy, it's broadly, I guess, campist is the way you would describe it, in terms of, this is a man who openly supports any foreign dictator as long as they are opposed to Western interests, regardless of the veracity of whether or not they're a good leader. And I don't see where the coalition of voters is bought by this particular set of policy prescriptions, right? Like, if you want to, I think there's a space open. I think many people have admitted it at this point, that for a kind of left-wing party in terms of the economy that also can campaign on towards kind of more authoritarian social policy. But there are so many different parts of his prospectus that would put off anybody from those of these different camps. For example, if you're part of the kind of the anti-woke voters who want to, get rid of all of the discussions of identity politics, even though they seem to be the people themselves who are the most obsessed with it, Paul, but regardless, these are also the kind of people who will be super put off by anybody who might undermine British defence by supporting people who are technically opposed to Western political interests globally. So that's broadly the reason why Corbyn lost so much support from 2017 to 2019, was this expose of him as being a fan of Hezbollah and Hamas, for example. Obviously, nonsense claims, but that's the claim that Rishi Sunak made about George Galloway that could be used to undermine that particular voting cohort. And those of us coming from a socialist perspective, for example, on the economy, would immediately get put off by the kind of climate skepticism, those kind of claims that you've seen from him in regards to policy as well. So there's not a broad coalition there either. Very funny that one of his candidates that spoke at his launch event there talked about wanting to bring back industry to the deindustrialized areas of the north and those kind of areas. And I'm like, yeah, I 100% agree, but that's not coming back in terms of just regular commodity production. That's long gone. The industries of the future are going to be large-scale green investment. And if you're going to be a anti-net zero party, or at least be a skeptical of net zero, then where's the investment going to come for these jobs, which are going to have to be green jobs? And this doesn't make sense either. And on top of that, if you're going to be part of this kind of socially conservative background, how are you ever going to get the broad support of the kind of Corbyn era of politics who are broadly incredibly socially progressive, which is diametrically opposed to the kind of politics that George Galloway represents? As for the candidates, Monty Panazar is certainly somebody who I have a lot to agree with. I think he's good on climate change. He's good on things like mental health, and big fan of him on the cricket field as well. But outside of that, it doesn't look like they've got many kind of people with huge amounts of star quality other than people who were on MEPs however many years ago. So really and truly, I don't see the route to which Galloway can have broad enough appeal or broad enough star quality to actually win that many seats at the next election.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I don't think they're going to win many seats. I think George Galloway keeping his seat would be an extraordinary accomplishment. It's very unusual to win a seat in a by-election as a non-legacy party and to keep it. If they add to it, I think if they got 2 seats, that would just be mind-boggling, And I think the big challenge really with Galloway, looking at the experience of Respect, the political party he was involved in response to the Iraq War, is can they keep it up? If this is going to be a coherent political formation, which has 2 seats after the general election, and then they have, a bunch of second places, a bunch of third places, they'll contest those again in the election thereafter. You can become a national political party. That's possible. But with Galloway, history indicates that he's like a shooting star. You see him, but then he sort of disappears from view. That may not be the case this time, but that's the tendency we've seen historically. Also on the opportunist sort of label he gets, this is what I find particularly interesting with Galloway, is that on certain issues, he is absolutely principled. He was involved in Dundee politics when Dundee twinned with Nablus in Palestine in, I think, 1980. That was part of his initiative in Dundee. So he's clearly cared about Palestine and the politics of that region for decades. I don't think he's what they call a grifter. I don't think he's a grifter on Palestine at all, actually. But there are some other areas where, I do think he's very opportunistic. So very high integrity on some things, and I think the opposite on others, which is unusual, right? People are either one or the other. There's one sure sign that George Galloway is set to be a disruptive force against centrist politics, however, and that is because the media is already spooked. On Good Morning Britain, Galloway was asked about remarks he once made about Saddam Hussein.
Were you right about Saddam Hussein when you said to his face in a meeting with him, this monster, this tyrant, that you respected him and that he was indefatigable? I mean, everybody makes mistakes. I'm just wondering if you look back at your political career, if that was one of them.
Well, I've made lots of mistakes, but not that one. And that jibe doesn't quite have the sting it used to.
It's not a jibe, it's reportage. It's what happened. You sat with him in the same room, opposite him in a chair, and you described your respect for him, and you said that you saluted his indefatigability.
Yeah.
Now, that's not
congratulations
that's what you
for
said.
Getting it right. I was speaking about the Iraqi people, and it was 25 years ago. You might have found some newer cuttings to throw at me.
And
but
George
it doesn't
Galloway,
have
I did find
sting.
a newer cutting, which was from Rishi Sunak, and you dismissed that as well. So I
think everyone's dismissing Rishi Sunak. Nothing he says is of any value. He might not even be
you
there.
You dismiss every question that you ask.
He might not even be there.
Okay, he is the Prime Minister of this country.
on what you just said. You were not. I'm sorry. I've seen the tape of that meeting with Saddam Hussein. You were not talking about the Iraqi people. That may have been something you referred to later.
Do you mean the tape from 1993?
It doesn't matter when it was. It's on tape.
Well, you've already asked me in this studio about that many times.
About the Iraqi people. You weren't. You were talking about Saddam Hussein, who's a monster. It was a monster.
Do you want to speak about 2024 and the upcoming general election?
Mr. Galloway, background's important.
30 years ago, when
it's important.
In this studio, I have spoken about this decades ago.
That was Galloway getting the same treatment we all had to witness being dished out to Jeremy Corbyn. But unlike Corbyn, Galloway fought back.
The British people are in a state of crisis. Our country can't even defend its own border. It can't even keep control of the thousands of people who have arrived here illegally. The NHS is in total crisis. Our country's falling apart around our ears, and you want to talk about something that happened 30 years ago?
For my MP, and I learned or was reminded that he had once cozied up to Saddam Hussein, it would give me pause for thought. I think it's worth reminding people that happened.
Well, I was right about Iraq.
You weren't right about Saddam.
It's you that was miserably wrong.
What do you mean?
You've got cuttings on me. I've got cuttings on you. You parroted your support for a war that turned into an absolute cataclysm. Yet you sit there as if none of it ever happened.
Who watches the watchers? We know the answer is George Galloway. For the record, what he's saying about Saddam and those very famous comments now about indefatigability, at the time, they were misreported. From what I've seen, subsequent reportage, Galloway's own comments in 2004, he was making those comments about the Iraqi people. He did protest the conduct of the Iraqi government in the 1980s, and he was very critical of both the US and the UK supporting Iraq in the Iraq-Iran war. So I think Madley's being very unfair there. But with Richard Madley KO'd, it was the turn of Susanna Reid to have a go.
I know your war record.
Standing for Parliament, not Richard Madley. So why won't you answer the question?
About Iraq 30 years ago?
Yes.
This is absurd, preposterous. And you're reminding me all over again why I stopped coming here. Because this banality, this triviality, this fetishization of press cuttings.
Okay, so you won't answer questions about a few weeks ago, and you won't answer questions about a few 30 years ago.
I'm here to talk
why
about
don't we
Britain.
ask you, what is the question you would like to ask yourself?
I'd like to ask myself, and wish you had asked me, about Monty Panesar, the famous left-arm spin bowler, English cricket ace, who's standing for Parliament for us in Southall. That's interesting and current.
This is liquid Galloway. This banality, this triviality. And then he talks about the 2007 Wisden Cricketer of the Year, Monty Panesar, who'll be standing for his new party. He keeps things interesting. Look, there's so much to talk about here. I think actually it is pretty remarkable that of all the politicians attacked for their political positioning in regards to Iraq, he opposed the sanctions on that country, which, by the way, destroyed Iraq in the early 1990s, and he opposed the 2003 invasion. Of all the politicians to criticize in this country with regards to their position on Iraq, Galloway would absolutely be at the back of the queue, unless, of course, you work for the British media. Let's see where things went next.
That's interesting and current.
That is interesting and current. I'd like to take you back to something else that's interesting and current, and that is what our own Prime Minister said on the steps of Downing Street when you were elected member for Rochdale. It is beyond alarming that last night the Rochdale by-election returned a candidate who dismisses the horror that happened on October the 7th, who glories Hezbollah, and was endorsed by Nick Griffin, the racist former leader of the British National Party.
Well, what am I?
I asked you,
am I the Muslim candidate? Richard asked me off camera if I was a practicing Muslim.
Yes, based on...
I'm a practicing Roman Catholic. That's how good his press cuttings are.
I was referring you to your online profile, which talks about your conversion to Islam a number of years ago.
Well,
I was simply asking if that was
false.
still a part of your life.
False. Still a part of my life.
I'm just
It's
asking.
never been a part of my life.
Then why is that?
I'm a Roman Catholic in good standing. Okay?
Why do you think that profile is there on many, many websites that you converted to Islam many years ago?
I don't know. It's probably running out of the same school as Rishi Sunak's false statements standing on steps in Downing Street. Isn't the key word, Susanna, elected?
Yes.
I got more votes than all the other parties put together.
Yes, but my question wasn't how many votes you got. My question was which of those statements by Rishi Sunak is wrong?
All of them.
Well,
I don't dismiss the horror of what happened on October 7th.
Good.
It's completely baseless.
Good.
I don't glorify Hezbollah, and I wasn't endorsed by Nick Griffin. Make up your mind, am I the champion of the Muslims, or am I endorsed by a guy who hates Muslims?
And Nick Griffin tweeted in February this year.
He issued a tweet.
Get out and vote for George Galloway today. He's not perfect, but it's the best way by far to stick two fingers up to the rotten political elite and their fake news media cronies. I didn't say you were responsible, George Galloway.
Why are you putting it to me?
I said what was wrong about the fact that you're endorsed by Nick Griffin, the racist
Susanna Reid
leader of
was
the
his
BNP.
favourite television presenter.
I would absolutely reject that endorsement.
As I absolutely reject it.
Good.
As I did.
Well,
so
there
there's
we go.
three
We
statements.
finally got to the end
There's three
of
statements.
the first question we
all
asked
of them
you 10 minutes ago.
I like Susanna Reid, but these people make absolutely no sense. If Tommy Robinson said you were his favourite presenter, or Nick Griffin said he was your favourite presenter, what would you do? I would absolutely reject what? Reject the assertion that you're their favourite TV presenter? What on earth are you talking about? And I have to say, I know that Galloway elicits all kinds of responses from all kinds of people on different issues to different extents. Like everybody has an opinion on George Galloway, right? He's one of those people, a bit like Farage. But I have to say, him going after the media and going after the political establishment and the way he's talking about the country being in freefall is incredibly popular. I don't agree with what he's saying about border control and small boats, etc. I don't agree with that. But there'll be many, many people who are actually looking at reform who think, this guy's talking lots of sense. Now, are they going to vote for the Workers' Party? I don't think so. But it's going to recalibrate the political conversation to a significant extent. George Galloway wasn't finished, though. After that interview, he posted this. If I believed everything I read on the internet, I'd think Richard Madley stole 2 bottles of champagne and was a shoplifter. He isn't. He just forgot to pay for them. If there's a person that knows libel law in this country, it's George Galloway. He sued the newspapers enough times. The government has announced a shock operation to detain asylum seekers marked for deportation to Rwanda. But it turns out they don't know where almost 2/3 of them are. According to Home Office data, the department has lost contact with thousands of potential deportees, amounting to 62% of the people it wants to remove to the African nation. That's right, 62%. The government says it wants to deport 5,700 people to Rwanda by the end of the year. That seems a bit of a stretch, given Rwanda says it can only take 200 a year. But it's even more of a stretch when nearly 3,000 of those people may have vanished. And why wouldn't you vanish if you're being threatened with removal to a country 4,000 miles away? Now, the reason for the apparent disappearances is that the individuals involved are not under Home Office reporting restrictions. According to the Times, the Home Office instead relies on the incentive of free accommodation and a weekly allowance of £49 to stop people from vanishing. But in the face of deportation, those incentives clearly aren't going to be enough. Speaking to GB News, Health Secretary Victoria Atkins tried to defend the Home Office.
On this point about the numbers, though, Eamon, it's important to understand there are different arrangements for different people. So, for example, some people are detained, others are allowed to live with friends or families, but they should be reporting into the Home Office regularly so that they keep that relationship up. Now, of course, the Home Office will be checking these people and will be finding these people. You know, the law enforcement visits massively increased in the last year. That's important important because we have to have the enforcement message around this as well as the deterrence message.
But I don't know why anyone should believe that you think you will find these people. I mean, your own impact assessment was that a few people might disappear through the system, but it appears a huge miscalculation. When you talk about the deterrent effect of Rwanda, do you ever expect to be losing half of those that your own government earmarked for removal? The incentive of £49 a week and also free accommodation is clearly not enough to keep them checking in with you.
So I'd ask everyone to look at the evidence of what we've done in the last year. So in the last year, we saw the number of small boats crossings fall by a third.
Yeah, but none of that's important. If these people get to our country and then they disappear, they can just go where they want, they can do what they want, and you haven't got a clue where they are.
This is really extraordinary, because what you just saw there was a Tory minister completely alienating the audience that the whole vicious Rwanda scheme is meant to appeal to. No wonder they're polling 20%. They'll be lucky to get that at this rate. And one of the fans of that scheme is former Chief Immigration Officer Kevin Saunders. On Radio 4's Today programme, he explained what he thought of the disappearing asylum seekers.
When the Home Office says that they are not missing, is that not true?
I wouldn't like to say that the Home Office are telling porkies here, but let's say that they temporarily can't find them.
Okay. They have said, the Home Office, that there are different levels of reporting appointments and therefore some report in different ways. Is this essentially, this number comes from those who failed to turn up to scheduled appointments and who can't be reached on any phone numbers or other contact details that the department has?
It's people that they've lost contact with.
Okay, which rather does suggest that they are missing, or there's no real reason to suggest that they are suddenly then going to appear.
They're not going to appear, or certainly not in the UK. They'll probably turn up in Ireland, but they know that they are in the frame to be removed. They don't want to be removed, so they're going to disappear.
So what is the answer to this, do you think? Because I know, I understand that I think you are a supporter of this policy. Is that right, the Rwanda policy?
Yeah, oh dear, yes, I am. I do think it'll work.
Well, how will it work?
Well, we know it'll work because people are disappearing already. They don't want to go to Rwanda. So we're seeing people now disappearing because they've been told they're on the list, so to speak. Going to Ireland, first of all, disappearing into the unregulated economy.
Again, just let that sink in. Supporters of the Rwanda scheme think that people disappearing into the grey economy rather than leaving the country is a sign of its success. Helena, listening to all this, I feel like I'm in a parallel universe. I mean, we've talked many times about how the point of Tory policy on undocumented migration is dysfunction. But it's now getting to the point of parody, isn't it?
I mean, it's just another episode in the litany of continual Conservative embarrassments and failures that we've been subjected to for 14 years of total incompetency. I've said many times on my show and on this show that the Conservative Party are not interested in the role of governance. They've never cared about the role of governance. They are an election-winning juggernaut who continue to start their campaign period as soon as the last one ends. Election's over, right, we're campaigning for the next election. They can't be bothered to actually think about, what the actual impact of the policies that they do are, because all they are for electoral performance. Let's think about what's actually happened here. These people who've been threatened with deportation or whatever it might be, they've all gone underground. You say into the grey economy. Well, it's obviously where they're going to be going, right? Either they're going to be just somewhere off grid, or they're just going to be in the hands of gangs at this point, which is exactly the kind of thing that the people who are worried about irregular migration and asylum seekers and whatever's happening in that situation, this is exactly the thing that they're supposed to be worried about. They're supposed to be worried about the fact that all Albanian gangs are coming over to the UK, exploiting irregular migrants to be able to have engaging in crime under the purview of without police scrutiny or whatever it might be. And this is exactly what's happening as a response to the fact that the Tories can't even bother doing this policy properly. It's ridiculous. And this is on top of the fact that in January last year, there was a report of the fact that the Conservative government lost 200 children. 200 children just gone from their records, who are asylum seekers who were stuck in hotel limbo waiting for their claims to get processed because they don't fund the system to actually process claims properly. I mentioned this on Twitter beforehand, where we got this point where people with genuine claims are sitting around in limbo. people without genuine claims, or people who are here for nefarious means, have more license to do so because they're here way before we had the ability to be able to vet them, and those who want to get rid of can just go underground and completely ignore it and cause the problems that they want to be caused. These kind of things should be government-ending scandals. But because we've just had like gaffe after gaffe after calamity after sea, it's just become normal now. Like the government can just essentially get away never being in any way useful at all, not being competent in any way, shape or form, and just limping along to the next election, hoping for some kind of magic, some kind of magic to get pulled out of a hat, which is just never going to exist. Absolute shambles.
Such a key point. The Tory election campaign for the next election literally finishes the day after they win the previous election. That's how they've been operating since 2010. It's clearly not very good for the country. Take back control. That was the calling card of the 2016 Brexit referendum. Give power back to the people. And remember, more people voted in that referendum than any election in this country's history, with the exception of 1992. And for a while at least, both major parties were shaken by an influx of members. But Graham Brady, Tory MP and chairman of the 1922 committee, thinks that went too far, specifically in allowing party members to vote for a party leader while in government. Here's what Mr. Brady said while speaking recently to students at Durham University.
Essentially what he'd done was allow the party members in the country to have the final choice between two. And the 1982 committee was given the task of electing the two. And that's the system we've had ever since 1998. But I'm the first chairman of 22 who has had to operate it while we've been in government. Which sounds like a great future. So, I mean, my view is that was a mistake to introduce that rule. I think it's fine to have the party members voting on the leader when you're in opposition. But in a parliamentary system where essentially you can only remain Prime Minister if you enjoy the confidence of your party in Parliament, it seems to me crazy that we now have different mechanisms in that the parliamentary party, the Conservative members of Parliament, can get rid of the leader by voting on confidence, but then the leader is supplied by the party members. So I would, from choice, I would remove that final vote for the members when the party is in government.
I like those moments there where it says inaudible. I'm reminded of Paul Whitehouse on the Far Show. He had a sketch as a sort of old Tory duffer, red rosy cheeks, and he said, they're drunk. And it's kind of reminiscent of that, this inaudible warbling, posho warbling by Graham Brady. So Brady there is talking about changes implemented in 1998 by William Hague, very controversial. They took powers away from Conservative associations in being able to select local candidates, but in turn gave them powers to have the final say in choosing the party leader. Now, I have to say, I'm sympathetic to his argument. Having a party membership choosing the next prime minister strikes me as unwise and not especially democratic. With that system, Liz Truss could have scrapped net zero and declared war on God knows where, having only been voted with 81,000 people behind her. Secondly, and this is fascinating, Brady there is saying this can't be changed because members won't agree to such changes. Can you imagine Keir Starmer saying that about anything? We'd like to change this thing which makes party members less powerful, but they never agree, so we can't do it. Oh well. A very different default from the Labour Party. Helena, this is what really intrigues me. It's why I want to talk about it on tonight's show. From the SNP to Corbynism and Brexit, it does feel like we're in a moment now where the establishment is trying to put the last decade back in a box, for better and also for worse. Could we be seeing the first glimmers of the establishment saying, actually, party members shouldn't choose leaders at all? I know that's not what Graham Brady is saying here, but it feels like it's the beginning of that conversation. We could be on the start of a slippery slope.
I 100% think that's the case. They're trying to usher in a post-populism era of UK politics, trying to put, again, it was a populist period that they're trying to put behind us and trying to move things back towards the kind of sensible centrist politics, but quote unquote, of course, And that's not what the public want. If you look at the polling in terms of whether people saw the political class as being people who represented them or having one of the main parties that represented them, in the 2019 election, the plurality of people saw political parties that represented their viewpoints, whether it was Labour or Conservative at the very least. Now that figure is around about 20%. It's a supermajority in favour of the opposite. And now, instead of having things that represent broadly what the people do want, it's what the political class, our journalists, our media class expect from our politicians that they represent now. What's interesting, I mentioned Nadine Dorries on a previous show. She talks about it in her book, the way in which things get fixed in the background to meet what the internal Conservative Party want rather than what the membership wants. I mean, obviously, from the Liz Truss period, there's at least some understanding as for the political consequences of that, as well as obviously the economic ones. But I actually think the problem with the Liz Truss era isn't the fact that she was elected by members. It was the fact that she wasn't held to any of the manifesto commitments that they were elected on in 2019. I think that's the real problem where I would disagree with you about a small number of people choosing the Prime Minister, because they chose to elect people at the general election based upon a set of manifesto commitments that they then just have completely binned with no mandate to do so. That's a problem that I have. I just think that people don't want there to be mass movement politics in this country. And it's especially prominent in UK politics because of how class-based interaction with politics is broadly and generally. The kind of people who staff our media organisations, the kind of people who become journalists, the kind of people who are not just MPs for political parties, but who are the power brokers behind the scenes, the ones deciding policy, because that's now being subcontracted out to think tanks in both cases with parties, rather than the membership deciding on policy more broadly. All these people all went to the same schools, they're all privately educated, and this kind of class disparity that sets where the acceptable discussion on politics is outside of that 2014 to 2020 period. Those are the people who, saw their power kind of start slipping away from in that populist period and are trying to consolidate it by trying to get rid of mass movement politics altogether.
Couldn't agree more. In the last week, we've seen Labour MP Ben Bradshaw talk about how actually Tony Blair was right to invade Iraq. Then we've seen, obviously, Alistair Campbell was always around. Tony Blair is, of course, the founder of the Tony Blair Institute. They're basically writing the Labour Party manifesto. And then we have Richard Madley attacking George Galloway on all things Iraq. It is an alternative reality, and I think that's absolutely right. I think we're coming, or the plan is to take us out of an era of populism. Of course, it's very hard to do that when the fundamentals haven't changed. The economy's not growing. Living standards are still flat. People aren't happy. They don't feel represented. I personally think this rush back to the centre is absolutely going to benefit parties like George Galloway, Reform, or whatever emerges on both the radical left and radical right over the next 5 years. Keir Starmer is a very good liar, and he should be. He's had plenty of practice. But on Good Morning Britain, he took it to another level.
Just want to remind viewers of what you said to Nick Ferrari on LBC shortly after the October the 7th catastrophe. Let's have a look.
I'm very clear. Israel does have that right to defend herself, and Hamas bears responsibility.
A siege is appropriate? Cutting off power, cutting off water?
Well, I think that Israel does have that right. It is an ongoing situation.
Cutting off water, cutting off power. Now, you lost a lot of support when you said that.
I'm really glad you played the whole clip, so thank you for that, because when I said does have that right,
yes,
I was referring to the right to self-defence. So I was having a conversation about self-defence. Mm-hmm. I was not suggesting they had the right to cut off water or food. They do not have that right. I managed to have the opportunity to clarify that pretty quickly afterwards.
I'm really glad you played the whole clip. So thank you for that. The whole clip doesn't make it any better, Keir. I mean, this guy is really good at lying, right? He's clearly got a lot of experience, not just going back to the start of his political career, 2015, decades. This is real pedigree. On the question of whether a siege and cutting off water and power was appropriate, you clearly said, quote, "I think that Israel does have that right." And you absolutely did not clarify those remarks quickly afterwards. And the LBC interview was on the 11th of October last year. Days before, the UN had already clarified that cutting off water and electricity to civilian populations is against international law. And yet, in the days after your LBC appearance, you arranged this, Keir.
Do you think cutting off food, water and electricity is within international law?
I think that Israel has an absolute right to defend itself against terrorism.
That's not the question I asked.
It is an answer to the question that you've asked, and I think it's an appropriate one at this time.
The UN Human Rights Commissioner says the imposition of sieges that endanger the lives of civilians is prohibited under international humanitarian law. Keir Starmer, your leader, a human rights lawyer, says Israel does have the right to impose a siege. Who is right?
In situations of war, where there are allegations of war crimes, that must ultimately be a matter for the UN and its agencies and for the ICC. No. I'm sorry, Victoria, that is the case.
Keir Starmer says Israel has a right to impose a siege.
I don't...
Who is right?
Keir Starmer has said right from the beginning that any war, it's important that democracies uphold the rules-based order and that must be within international law.
Do you think Israel breached international law by cutting off water and power supplies?
Look, I think this is an extraordinarily complex and fast-moving situation. There are 200 hostages.
And what's the answer to the question?
Well, look, Israel has the right to self-defence and it has a duty to secure the release of its hostages.
Sure. But my question was,
ensure that international law is upheld.
Right, and so my question is, do you think Israel has breached international humanitarian law by cutting off water and fuel supplies?
Well, in the last 24 hours, we've seen water, medicine and food enter Gaza.
I am going to ask the question again. Do you think Israel breached international law by cutting off power and water supplies?
Look, I'm not going to sit in your studio and grandstand and tell you that I'm going to make big pronouncements about what Israel is and isn't doing.
So, Keir Starmer, if you quickly clarified your remarks, why were shadow ministers going on the telly and still refusing to say that Israel was in breach of international law? Instead, they were dodging the question. As were you when you gave this interview later on the very same day that you appeared on LBC.
Keir Starmer, you've said that Israel has the right to defend itself. Does that include cutting off food, water, power to Gaza?
Well, what we've seen is appalling and shocking acts of terrorism, the murder of men, women, children, by Hamas. And so responsibility lies with Hamas, and Israel has the right to defend herself and take action in relation to the ongoing hostage situation. Obviously, this is within the framework of international law.
But does that include cutting off food, water, fuel to Gaza, where, as we know, hundreds of thousands of civilians are living?
I think that international law matters and everything should be done in accordance with international law.
You didn't clarify those remarks there either. And you still refused to say that Israel has actually broken any international laws at all. Helena, at the start of this clip, we showed Keir Starmer lying about lying. I mean, this is really... Politicians lie. Keir Starmer is in a very small group of politicians who lies about lying. In the league table of political liars, there's many of them, where is Keir Starmer? Towards the top?
Oh, it's just an innocent little mistake, I've been told by all of the many people in my mentions on social media. No, it's just, I think he really does have to rank up there as somebody who has consistently taken contradictory positions over and over and over again based upon political expediency. And I actually don't think this is necessarily Keir Starmer, the person being especially that much of a liar himself. I think this is an artifact of the fact that I think he's just a political lightweight, really and truly. Somebody who was thrust into politics because he was asked to, essentially, by people in the background of the Labour Party, who was getting his prescriptions on what he should or shouldn't say handed to him on a daily basis, because I don't think he necessarily knows the positions that he should or shouldn't be taking, because he's a lawyer, right? The guy clearly knows the international law says that this is illegal when it clearly is, right? We've all seen it, we all know now, and we knew at the time. And that is essentially now after trying to think, I can kind of, or at least the people in the background think, we can try and use the chicanery here to, at the very least, to try and not get into this conversation about Israel that we don't want to get into, lest we get accused of anti-Semitism. And then on top of that, then trying to roll that back as soon as it becomes politically expedient to do so. And that's unfortunately what's going to happen to you if you act like a political weather vane for the entirety of the election period, because you just want to look at whatever is palatable to voters rather than having any moral position, any ethical position, or even having a solid position that is rooted in your supposed knowledge base, which is law. And the fact that he continues to avoid any scrutiny of this from our media and kind of the liberal establishment, it's honestly, it's astounding. If this was Boris Johnson, imagine if this was Boris Johnson doing the same things, the man who we literally booted out of the leadership position in this country off the back of the fact that he lied to Parliament, amongst many other lies and many other things that he did. Would the liberal media be giving him this much of a pass? Absolutely not. Not a chance that he'd be given a pass if this was Boris Johnson. But because it's Keir Starmer and he's sensible and he's got the nice haircut, he gets away with it. He just gets away with taking completely contradictory positions. He'll go, well, I'm glad you let me clarify that. And they go, oh, okay, so you have clarified that. Brilliant, we'll move on now. No, scrutinise him. Scrutinise him for 5 minutes, please. What the hell is going on? I feel like we stumbled into a parallel universe here. It's ridiculous.
And compare it, by the way, to George Galloway, who's almost being waterboarded by Madeleine and Susanna Reid on the same show, the same morning. Very contradictory treatment of the two. And also, of course, Corbyn. Compare the treatment to Corbyn. Even when Corbyn's position was entirely consistent, it was taken apart, put back together, unsewn, torn apart, cut up with a scissor, dissolved in acid. They had to mutilate any political position he ever held in his entire life until it could be something that was media-friendly, something that would cause a controversy. Like you say, with Starmer, they do the complete opposite. Before we go, I just want to say there is a link in our description if you want to support our work here at Novara Media, novaramedia.com/support. We're trying to build a new media for different politics. There is going to be a general election soon, this year, almost certainly, and we want to cover that in a very unique, special, and independent way. That's the key word, independent. We're not on hock to the millionaire class or indeed the billionaire class. We want to get the facts to you. So if you want to be a part of that, go to novaramedia.com/support. And like I say, you can just click that link in the description below. Helena, thanks for joining me this evening.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Really great show today, and I look forward to the next one.
It was fun. Lots of videos. So, lots of Helena, less of me, and lots of clips. Great clips. Politics is going to be very interesting the rest of this year. Thanks to all of you for tuning in. Come back tomorrow for another stream from 6 p.m. You've been watching Novara Media. Good night.